one of my colleagues, Joachim Kurz, came up with a great introduction at a workshop a few weeks ago. He said, the first speaker is Rudolf Wagner, and if you don't know Rudolf Wagner, you shouldn't be here. And almost in the same way, you could say the same thing about Timon Screech. Now, if you don't know him, and you're interested in Japanese culture and art, you probably shouldn't be here either, but you probably already know him. So there's almost no need for me to introduce him. So what do I really say? Just to recap, I just did my numbers as a historian. He has now been teaching at SOAS for a quarter century. So this is an institution, so to speak, in Japanese art history. He has been a professor of art history for a decade now. Originally, he started with a BA in Japanese studies at Oxford, did the usual Harvard PhD that many of the British Japanese studies people seem to have gone through, and immediately got a job at SOAS and stayed there ever since. Taught at Chicago, at Japanese universities, will be at Berkeley for his current sabbatical, will then go to Todai to teach. And then I was looking on his Wikipedia German entry that exists, what the Heidelberg connection may be. But yes, he confirmed he was a Ishibashi visiting professor at one point as a long line of great people that Melanie Trader is able to recruit to Heidelberg.
May I just add a secret? Tim speaks perfectly German, so if you read the Wikipedia, you know why he's written it.
In fact, I was asking what his shorthand was. He said, oh, does Myanmar and his little Burmese?
Yes, Burmese is Burmese is better than my German.
So, the Burmese secret notes he's taking. In fact, I can confirm that he speaks French, having been in Geneva, and us meeting up in Paris to evaluate Inalco. So I think that's probably the kind of transcultural element. In fact, he has published so many books and articles, I don't want to mention them individually. If I had to kind of come up with three basic themes, I would say Timon Screech and the body is a recurrent theme. It goes with sexuality and prostitution, I suspect. The second one is urban space, that comes as a recurrent theme, and what we hear about today is also based on a book published in the year 2000 on Sadanobu, and the third theme, and especially in this building, I would call transcultural. Before Heidelberg tried to monopolize that term, certainly there's lots of European-Japanese cultural exchange as a topic of his research and publications. And I remember I once invited him to be the keynote speaker of the first EAJS, European Association of Japanese Studies conference, when we started off to have conferences in Japan, in Kyoto. And he looked about Christianity and the banning of it and the British influence, a fairly kind of controversial topic that Monumenta Nipponica didn't really want to touch, and it ended up being published in Kyoto at Japan Review. Now, I'm probably less familiar with his publications than any of you are, but certainly I can confirm and vouch that he's a great speaker, and we're very much looking forward to what he has to say to us now. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. That's really embarrassing to be standing here and hear those things said about me. Thank you very much. It's much too complimentary, and now you're going to be terribly disappointed by what happens in the next 20 minutes or so. And also, now that Matthew just stepped back into the room, he's a very hard act to follow with what we all just learned so much. My talk, I hope, also will have some repercussions in what Joshua will say after the break, since the time period is rather similar. So, we've been asked really to think about, to question the idea of Kyoto as the eternal capital, and we just heard from Matthew about a reconstruction, a moment of extraordinary, careful, not to say expensive, reconstruction of the city that happened under Yoshimitsu. And I would sort of say the opposite today, which is about one of the great destructions of Kyoto. Transitions can come by if somebody comes along and builds something new, but also somebody comes along and erases things. And as we've just heard in the discussion session, so often the act of building is actually an act of destruction. Something was probably there before. At any rate, my specific moment of destruction is 1788. And if you've done some reading around, as everyone in this room surely has done, you'll know that 1788 was the Great Fire of Kyoto. But if you're somebody who hasn't done any reading around, you will be surprised to hear that there ever was a Great Fire of Kyoto. People do know, of course, the Oriental disturbances, and sometimes in medieval Kyoto there was massive destruction. But the usual belief, and certainly the belief that the tourist board likes people to, the myth that likes people to absorb, is that basically after Hideyoshi, it's all just stays the way it is right through until the miraculous non-destruction of Kyoto during the Second World War, and so we happily have it there today. So I will use this one example of a case where that didn't happen. But the eternal quality of Kyoto is as a myth, is often contrasted with, of course, the extremely friability or mutability of the city at the other end of the torpedo of Edo. And in the same way that nobody would ever dream of, most people call Kyoto Kyoto at all times in its history, nobody would ever dream of calling Tokyo Edo or calling Edo Kyoto. We know that there was a huge split there. And we can deal with that split in nomenclature because throughout Edo's history it had these splits, and it was Edo's own personal myth to be a city that was forever disappearing and reappearing. And so that division was against Kyoto's eternality. And Matsudaira Sadanobu, who indeed somebody I wrote a book on and began my thinking on this, Matsudaira Sadanobu said to himself that the reason that Edoites, and he was not talking about Japanese people, he was talking about Edoites, love little things. You know, it's the same in Japan, isn't it? You have to have a pair of headphones that folds up into a little box, and nothing is big. It's because it's very simple. At any minute somebody will say, flee with all your goods, the city's on fire. Mm-hmm. And his case was that when you have a box containing the pieces for the Go game, the lid of the box will be taken off and that will be the board. Right? So in Kyoto, in Edo, it's always about linking things, making them smaller, making things multi-purpose, and you can run with them if you need to. And anyone who lives in Kyoto doesn't have that experience. About that same period, just before the fire I'm talking about, a shogunal official called Kimura Boun, he wrote a book called Mita Kyo Monogatari, Tales of the Capital with a small c perhaps, that I have seen. And he deliberately contrasts this with Minu Kyo Monogatari, which is, I don't know, there must be a German expression, but made up stories, right? I mean, stories, someone who hasn't seen the capital says what it's like, and of course they're making it up. So that was an Edo expression for tall tales or something, we might say. And he said, no, I've been there and I've seen it, and this is what I've seen. There was a very long and very interesting account of what he thinks in Kyoto. But one thing particularly struck me is in the evening he's walking along Sanjo or Hashi, and he sees all the lanterns bobbing around in the breeze, people having dinners out and on the camel, and he says, wow, if that was Edo, you'd think it was a fire. All these red lights along. And for him, that was one of his big distinctions. Kyoto, he said as he walked around, there's wood everywhere, there's stone everywhere. Temples are on stone bankments or with terraces. In Edo, there's no stone. In Edo, there's no old trees. In Kyoto, it's full of trees. And he went on and on about this. And in fact, then he came into, Kimura Boun just simply wrote about Kyoto, but there's always an implication in what he's saying that the Edo he knows is the opposite. And then we get a whole genre in Edo literature of Santo Kurabe, the capital, the comparisons of the three cities. And of course they're cliches, and all historians will say it wasn't really like that, but the myth they're circulating is that Edo, it's the fires break out every year, just like the cherry blossoms. In Kyoto things are frankly a bit boring. Things don't change very much there. Don't go to the prostitution district in Kyoto because it's so boring and the women talk funny and they don't have any sense of humour. But and then often Osaka's tacked on as well. It's a city of merchants, of course, and a city of fun. So these divisions, which are not only our modern day cliches, they were their own, suddenly run into this problem in 1788, because Kyoto does burn down, and it shouldn't have done. Right? It's 200 years almost into Tokugawa rule, there Kyoto has suddenly gone. And it happened on the last day of the first month of 1788. So in other words, it's the dead of winter, 30th of the first month. And the fire broke out in the afternoon, and it burnt through for about 3 days. And with, despite the talk about stone, of course, Kyoto is mostly wood, like any Japanese city, so sparks fly, and they set off the fire somewhere else. Edo had been under regulations already since the late 17th century that all buildings had to be tiled. So there weren't any wooden roofs or thatch roofs in Edo, so that sparks couldn't fly, start a fire somewhere else. But Kyoto had never had to introduce such regulations, so sparks flew. And then also Edo had quite established fire brigades, which Kyoto didn't have because it had never needed them. So by the time the fire burns out, there's about 1,500 city blocks have gone. That means basically the whole city. Almost 40,000 homes, 37 Shinto shrines, and 201 temples. The only part of the city which was relatively unscathed was the southeast, which is why today, wonderfully, we have the Sanju Sangendo still there, and a couple of other buildings, Kenninji's Abbacy, a couple of other buildings which survived then but are no longer there. But that little pocket remained. And what I was sort of interested in, not just this fire happened and how destructive it was, but how did people deal with it, given that they'd had their myth that this should not happen in Kyoto? Well, Kyoto was a city of many educated people, and in Japanese history many educated people are first of all poets, and they're also diarists. And so there's a whole range of writing comes out to deal with this. People interrupt their diaries. Something really wrong has happened. And then poets who are used to the beautiful kind of mellifluous waka, and in waka nothing more, dreadful happens than maybe a parting or a lost love, or the cherry blossoms fall too early, isn't that sad? And suddenly they kind of run into this discourse of waka usage, terms which shouldn't be part of it. Yakino, a wasteland. These are not part of classical canonical terminology, but are waka poems. It's very interesting. They don't say, court's dead, we'll not write waka, let's go to some other form. They don't say, let's write a gunkimon about it. They hold on to their classical terminology and rhetoric while trying to work through. And I have some examples, but I won't go into any of them today. But you can, of course, use your kakekotaba, your pivot word, in classical poetry to make a poem seem to be saying something for the first line and a half, and suddenly say something different in the other half, because the pivot changes the meaning. And the very clever poets were able to make something that looks quite nice suddenly turn into an atrocious poem about something terrible happening. Just one little one where the poet says, look around this morning and you will see that all is now a desecrated moor. In this burnt-out wasteland are yesterday's jewel-spread palaces. And we can make the kakekotaba around kokoyaki no, here yesterday, and this is a burnt-out wasteland. Right? And those sort of puns, which are, of course, what waka is all about, but you hadn't punned on those sorts of things before. Now, that same writer, whose name Fujishima Munenobu, I know nothing about him, whether his biography is known, except he was from a court family. And he says that he went to bed early in the evening, and, when you go to sleep, he falls into his dreams, and suddenly he hears bells ringing. And he wakes up and he thinks it's dawn. He slept much longer than he thought. He looks out the window and there is the beautiful dawn rising across the hills. He has a bath, he washes his hair, he writes some things in his diary, he goes out into the street, and of course it's not the dawn and he hasn't slept through the night. It's about 2 a.m. and it's the flames. And he says, it felt to me when I thought the sun should arrive, it's somebody had taken my ink and thrown it across the sky. which is a fantastic metaphor for somebody whose life had all been about beautiful writing. My ink is gone, and it's sort of exploded across this thing, which I can't describe anymore. So he does a few work on the subject, and then he sort of gives it up. But the conclusion that he and many other writers come to about this fire is that it couldn't just have been an accident. It must have been caused. Edo didn't have to have reasons for its fires. People knew it happened. There were earthquakes, there were kind of carelessness, there was just people living together. But it hadn't happened in Kyoto, so why had it happened now? And Munenobu says, remember and think how it was, with the passing of generations, that we have come to this point. The Tsuburagi, right, the emperor, the Tsuburagi of the Enryaku era, moved the capital to this place, with mountains for its hems and a river for its girdle. He erected stout palace pillars. Surely these were blessings enough to last for 100 million years. He laid out the city to conform to the Germanic diagram of the four beasts, to be a changeless abode for the Tsuburagi for all times. How depraved have tidings come when a fire can break out even here? They needed, in other words, to find a reason for it, and the only reason they could come up with was there was a causation. As the Dutch, who arrived for one of their regular trips up to Edo shortly after the fire, the Dutch senior member says, people are considering this to be a great and extraordinary heavenly portent. It was caused by heaven. It wasn't caused by anything people had done, except, of course, that people's wickedness is what made heaven behave in this way. It was a kind of tenbatsu. So if heaven has sent this, who is to blame? Well, you'd say it's, of course, the shogun who's to blame, because he is the one who mediates between heaven and people, or given that this was Kyoto, and given that it was the Enryaku Tsuburagi who set it out, the emperor must have some role in what's gone wrong here too. And people who know more about this should, who know about the biographies can say more than I am capable of saying, but it is a rather interesting moment in the dynastic history of both the imperial house and the shogunal house. Simply put, the emperor and the shogun at this time should not have been there. Both of them are extremely problematic successions, and ones which did not meet everyone's approval. What had happened in the case of the imperial family is that they died out. Right? This happens occasionally, and when the imperial family dies out, of course, you bring in a cousin or something, but usually it didn't happen very often, because of the tradition, which I believe will happen when the current emperor and crown prince die, you hand the crown, or whatever you call it, the authority, through all boys in the generation, and then it goes down to the next generation, which minimises the possibility that any emperor will not have had a father who already was one. And fundamentally, there's only one rule required to be emperor of Japan. Your father has to have been before. Otherwise, anyone can do it. Right? And the problem was that the sitting emperor, it's a problematic term, let's call him emperor for now, whose name was Tomohito, and who would become Kokaku on his death. His father had not been an emperor. And it's one of the big moments in the Bakufu struggle with the court at this time. He's always trying to have his father, who's still alive, declared a retired emperor. So it's called the Songo Jiken, right? The incident of the honorific title, which he really wanted to be given to his father, but his father was never permitted. And as one writer put it about the emperor, it's not exactly as if people despise him because of his heritage, although some people actually don't think much of him. And for a Kyoto townsperson to have written that of an emperor, it's quite extraordinary. Right? You don't say that kind of thing about the emperor, unless you really have a problem with what's going on. So there is an emperor in the palace who should not be there. As for the shogun, well, the shogunate never had the rule of primogeniture, nor even really philogeniture. You could be a shogun without your father having been one. That had happened many times. Indeed, possibly the greatest shogun of the Edo period is Yoshimune, who was not the son of a previous shogun. He was brought in. So it doesn't quite matter that the shogun's not the son, but nevertheless he had inherited, not because, as in Yoshimune's case, the line died out, they therefore looked around and selected somebody who was especially good. What had happened in the case of the shogun, whose name is Ienari, his older brother, who had expected to inherit, who has the nice name Iemoto, right, the foundation of the Ie, right? This is Ieyasu, back to the start again. Everyone thought this young lad will probably be shogun on the 200th anniversary, which they were thinking of already. Now, his father, Ieyasu, was very keen on getting an Arabian horse. And he drew a picture of it. And he gave it to the Dutch, saying, I want one like this. The Dutch spent 6 years looking for a horse that exactly matched the shogun's drawing. And they found one. And they brought it to Edo, and the shogun was most impressed and thanked them for their great efforts on his behalf. The son, Iemoto, who's 19 at the time, asks to go for a ride on it, and you can guess what happens next. He falls off and dies. The shogun kills, according to the Dutch, 500 or 600 people in his rage. And the Dutch asked for a reciprocal present, and they're told to shut up and get out of town quite fast. The Dutch spend years asking for a reciprocal present for the horse until they're told it's a good idea if you shut up about it. So there's two rulers who perceive themselves to be problematic. They understand, they don't, they know that they shouldn't really be there, and then this happens. So what do they do about it? Well, the shogun Ienari, as with many shoguns, doesn't really rule, right? And he has a council of ministers, the elders, and it so happens that this fellow Matsudaira Sadanobu takes over just before, actually takes over the year of the fire, but he'd been building up to it before. So we're not so much talking about how does the shogun Ienari deal with the fire. It's more a question of how does his chief minister, Matsudaira Sadanobu, decide to deal with it from the Edo end of things. But to start off with the Kyoto end of things, how does the Tsuburagi decide to deal with it? Subsequently, Kokaku Tenno. Well, first of all, he has to move out, right? The palace is burning. And in times of disaster, the court would always relocate to the Shimogamo Jinja. So you go up the side of the river, it's not very far, to safety. But unfortunately, Shimogamo Jinja was also on fire at the time. And so they put him into his ox cart, and they take him across to the Shorenji, the temple of the perfect lotus, or however you want to translate it, the Shorenji, and all the way through the streets, it's filled with people who are in total state of panic because it's burned down. And again, according to the non-official records, because the records would never say this, the Emperor's Guard get out their swords and they cut down 1,000 people to make way for him to get through. And he immediately starts complaining to Edo about the inferiority of the temporary accommodations he's in, and then he gets an idea. The Kyoto palace is gone. He tells Matsudaira Sadanobu, this is a fantastic opportunity to build me a Heian-style palace. Now, I'd like to hear more from Matthew about this, because the relocation you mentioned, and you mentioned also Yoshimitsu building himself a kind of Shinden-tsukuri, but as far as I'm aware, there never had been a Heian-style palace from Heian until this moment. So the Kokaku Tenno, who's not a real Tenno, and some people, according to the records, scorn him for his succession, he decides he'll have a Heian palace. Well, the problem with that is, first of all, nobody knows how to build it anymore. It will be at least a third bigger than the current compound that the palace is on. But Kokaku Tenno says, never mind that, and he issues an edict that nobody else is allowed to buy any wood until all the wood necessary for rebuilding his palace has been procured. And again, I understand this is rumour. Somebody who knows the documents will say, where's the evidence for that? But rumour is terribly important, and after a fire, rumour is all we have. It is rumour that was circulating at the time, we know that. He also declared that all Heian palaces had all Heian palaces had 12 steps leading up to the imperial dais on which he would sit. He said he wanted all 12 in his new palace. Well, Matsudaira Sadanobu has to deal with these requests coming up from Edo, and he actually goes down to Kyoto to see what's going on. And he undertakes various activities while he's there. He agrees that the destruction of the city will allow for some transformations. One thing he does is he creates a brothel district, which of course Edo had, and he would have expected as a military man that should be. He says within only about 8 days of his arrival, at least 1,200 women have been moved into the fringes. And he said people come to Kyoto, he doesn't use the word Kyoto, people come to the city to see the beautiful sights. And within 10 days, issue of their arrival, all the money they brought from the provinces end up in the brothel district, or amongst women. So he creates a brothel district. If you want to go, you can go. But we don't want women wandering the streets, and so that's cleared out. So these kind of purgatorial events happen at the end of the fire, but then you have to think, what should I do about the palace? Now, Matsuda Sadanobu was a great historian. He really was interested in antiquarian issues. And I suspect he rather liked the idea. Kokaku Tenno might have very cleverly realised we're dealing with an Edo regime that might respond to this. If he knew he was going to be told, no, forget it, he might not have had a go. So Sadanobu says, I'll think about it. And then he goes back to Edo, and on the way back, of course, he naturally would stop in at Kunozan, the first burial place of Tokugawa Ieyasu before he was moved to Nikko. It's torrential rain, it's February by our stand, or maybe beginning of March, torrential rains, and he had a nice trick, he says, or maybe he only pretends to subsequently, but he writes in his diary, I went inside to pray to the Daigongen, and I asked for his opinion. You tell me what I should do to the palace. And he says, the sign I will take, the Daigongen is the sun, Nikko is the solar divinity. Show your face. Bring out the sun, and then I will know you want the palace to be rebuilt. And when he comes out, the sun is shining, the clouds have gone, there's no more rain, and Ieyasu has commanded him to rebuild the palace as it was. So he does it. Now, certainly it would fit with Sadanobu's antiquarian interests. He probably quite liked the idea of there being an old Heian-style palace. He, after all, did take advantage of the fire to revive certain court rituals which had been lost, such as the Aoi Matsuri, which is mentioned in the flyer, which was not performed for hundreds of years and was brought back by Matsuda Sadanobu. But I think in my closing suggestion is that he's actually trying to compromise the standing of the emperor via an overinflated kind of iconography. Now, the shogunate, as you know, lived in castles, and Kyoto had its big Nijo castle. And as a military regime, they couldn't do much about that. They, after all, had been battlefield figures. But it's also interesting that as the Edo period moves on, and certainly we get to the end of the 18th century, the shogunate has sort of tried to transform itself out of battlefield mode. Of course, they remain warriors, they wear swords, they live in castles, but if a castle burns down, they very ostentatiously don't rebuild it. Edo Castle lost its keep, and it was not rebuilt. And some people said Edo Castle keep was not rebuilt either because the shogunate didn't have the money to rebuild it, or because they didn't need it any longer as a military preparedness, because Edo doesn't need such a thing by the time it's burned down. But I think it's the opposite. I think that they were really embarrassed by that huge tower over the city. And when it's burnt down, the shogunate can recede to a kind of silence and absence and reticence, which is what throughout history most Japanese regimes had actually had. And you probably know the story of Nintoku Tenno. Nintoku Tenno, from very, very ancient past, probably a mythical person, but Nintoku Tenno went up onto the tower that his palace is supposed to have had, and he looked out and he saw there was no smoke rising from the fields, from the houses. And he said to his staff, why aren't the people cooking? Why aren't there any cooking fires? He said, well, the people are starving, they've got no food, that's why they're not cooking, that's why there's no smoke. So what did Nintoku do? He would not eat himself. He had no changes made to the palace, and they say his palace fell down. He could see the stars through the ceiling. His coverlets were soaked with dew, and that is why he was the ideal emperor for Japan forever after. Matsuda Sadanobu himself wrote that. So to put the emperor back in an enormous great palace, using wood that the commoners had wanted to build their own hovels with, but no, they can't, they have to have been tents until the palace is built, I think was a way of turning the emperor into somebody, frankly speaking, who nobody wanted around. Kōkaku tries to put the palace back into some kind of popular activity. In other words, it's not his grand thing that the commoners probably don't like. Anyone who did circumambulations of the palace, if you walked around the palace as an act of devotion, which nobody had ever done, you were given a free bowl of rice at the end of your circumambulation. Given the fact everyone was starving, everyone did it. So he says, there you see how honourable and magnificent I am. Meanwhile, in Kyoto, in Edo, well, nothing so dramatic at this time happened that would have allowed Matsudaira Sadanobu to do anything so grand as not rebuilding or rebuilding. There didn't happen to be a big fire at that moment. But he did do one thing, which the great gate into Edo was the Fukiage Mon, right? The Fukiage Gomon, which was a huge kind of double gate. You went through a gate and then you were caught in a kind of huge open area, and then there's another gate. The original intention was that any enemy thinks they've broken through the gate, but then they're stopped again. So it was a defensive mechanism that many castles had. And what Sadanobu does is he removes the inside gate. And then various members of the staff start saying, you can't remove the inside gate, what happens if there's a battle? So perversely, it's the lower-ranking officers saying, we want all this military stuff around. And Sadanobu is saying, no, we don't need it anymore, we're loved, we don't want it. And so he strips away the Fukiage gate. He also removes from his own mansion, which is inside the castle compound, he strips off all the ornamental plasterwork, leaving only bare boards. And one of his staff members, he doesn't write about this himself, one of his staff members says, when foreigners come to this place, to Edo Castle, they may come from the Ryukyu, they may come from Kara, they may come from Korea, and they may come from other places, probably meaning Holland. And when they look, they will see how, contrary to all their expectations, Japan is a site of modesty. Japan is a place, they will go home and tell their own kings, where augustness does not reside in flamboyance. Meanwhile, of course, in Kyoto, justice, authority was indeed starting to reside in flamboyance. Now, maybe this whole thing of rebuilding the palace went terribly wrong, because today a lot of historians look at it and look at the entire reign of Kōkaku Tenno as kind of the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. A lot of Sonno, imperial loyalist stuff happens around the time of Kōkaku Tenno. Being an unexpected succession, he was not just simply the next boy in line. He came in as an adult, and he ruled for decades. So he's one of the very few Japanese emperors who had the opportunity after the, well, even in the Insei period, right? They're in because they couldn't do anything as an emperor. Kōkaku Tenno is there for a long period, and he can stamp his idea on it. He even sends secretly presents to the Dutch East India Company. No emperor had ever done that. The Dutch are totally worried what they can do about it, because they're not supposed to have any relations with these things. Some such thing, Kōkaku Tenno. And when he dies, and this is what I'll finish with, when Kōkaku Tenno dies, word goes out, the Tenno is dead. And all the Kyoto people think, who? Never heard of anyone called a Tenno. Who's a Tenno? There hasn't been a Tenno in Japan since the Kamakura period. Nobody uses the word Tenno because he's not really an emperor anymore. The shogun does the ruling. They had other terms. And Kōkaku Tenno is interred as Kōkaku Tenno, absolutely without precedent. So maybe Sadanobu was the one who fell into the trap. It wasn't the Tenno that fell into the trap. In any case, things have unintended consequences, and that palace is not the one you still see today in Kyoto, but it's the architectural antecedent of the one you see in Kyoto today. Thank you.
I think the rest of it. To build or not to rebuild, that seems to be the question. The Great Fire of Heidelberg, we all know who is responsible for it. It's Louis XIV. And we know what that means to German-French relations for quite some time. The castle was not rebuilt. It is still a romantic ruin on top. In the city is medieval in grid pattern. So you have the ancestor, and then it is set in the 18th century. By the 19th century, Heidelberg no longer started evolving. Industrialization happened in Mannheim. So great fires seem to be tremendous turning points over the potential thereof. What you know of London, whenever you do your sightseeing tour, they only repeat one thing, 1666. But 1666 seems to be the turning point from a wooden type medieval city to real bricks to something that lasts. Except I forgot what the Shakespearean theatre was reset. But there are fires we seem to remember, and we seem to remember today. Just like you said in the introduction, Edo, the Meibiki fire, even if you're just a modern historian, you know it happened and it was devastating. But there are places where fires, I could not tell you really, a fire in German history. That fire. That, if I had to guess, the Great Fire of Berlin doesn't ring a bell to me. Hamburg, Munich. There is a Great Fire of Dresden connected to Bombay. So I think it's very interesting how the memories of fires of this transformative power is something that I find fascinating in your setup, that they didn't expect fires. Just like Kyoto is not expecting earthquakes. You know, you have Fukushima, people say, you don't need an earthquake insurance in Kyoto to save the money. So I think that issue, versus, the Edo no Hana, that we expect. So I think this history of fires or disaster and how you deal or expect them is one point that I would like you to think a little bit, or develop a little bit further for the discussion. There are two other issues that you didn't mention in your presentation, but I saw in the book. You asked Matthew about how do you call that baby? Is it a miyako? Is it something else? What is that location really? And you link the location to another location or space. Is it wa? Is it nihon? Does it belong together? So I tried to find out Kyoto and fire in your book, and I realized there were so few places until I realized I should have looked for Keisei and fire. Because you don't talk about Kyoto. You don't mention emperor, which you mentioned in the presentation. You mentioned Shujo as the term. So the terminologies. Why do you really think that it's important to use as an analytical tool the terms people were using in the plurality at the time? And is there such a thing as the beginning of modern Japanese culture through that transformative process of that fire and located to what we today call Kyoto? So I think that's the gist of my second question. The third one, as an art historian, you didn't talk much about art. You talked about intellectuals and about, how the fire runs through the diaries. But as a non-art historian, whenever I looked at one of those painting screens in Kyoto, I don't know who did them, but I always said, it would be someone who's called Kano. But why this hegemony of this particular art school that you link to Edo is so important to Kyoto? And why is that an expression of the Tokugawa shogunate? And what would have been the alternatives? Because when you mention rebuilt in the Heian style, just as the population of Kyoto didn't know they had a Tenno until he died, would they have been aware that the palace was rebuilt in the Heian style? How was that communicated? Or is it just among the elites they now know to look at? Could actually people look at the Imperial Palace? Or were they just like today, just so far behind the walls in the whatever gates, It was all in the realm of imagination. I simply don't know.
Thank you. That's an awful That's an awful lot of very interesting questions and points you've raised. I don't know if I can respond to every one of them because the whole question session will go. But a few things. I think, big fires, people have to find a way of explaining them. And Edo is really special that in a sense it doesn't. But one thing which actually was Sumie Jones who pointed this out to me, almost all Edo fires are blamed on a woman. And something about transformativeness, and women will never stay the same, and the man is always a man, the woman's a daughter, then a mother and a wife. So something about things can't be stabilised once women take them over. And I think there's something like that. But I would, no, I'm just throwing that out. This one, of course, did not have any woman at the bottom of it. The big one in Edo, the Fujisoto no Taika, of course, that's a classic case, but there are others as well. One other way that they thought, because of course they're operating in Nengo, and I kept on saying 1788, but that wasn't a meaningful way of describing the year to anyone living at the time. So it's a Tenmei, isn't it? Tenmei. And the people who were responsible for choosing the era names, the Nengo, seem to have made a really bad job of it at the end of the 18th century. Because first of all, you have Meiwa, right? Meiwa nen, Meiwa ichinen, Meiwa ninen, Meiwa sannen, Sanshigo. And somebody suddenly thought, oh my God, what comes do we get to 9? It's Meiwa kunen. And they were really concerned. And indeed, there was a huge fire. And then Tenmei, the scholars didn't know it, but in Edo popular common discourse, the word Tenmei meant something like something has really gone wrong, right? And it's heavens have screwed up for you. You can imagine what you might say in German, fucked up, So, and that was what they meant by Tenmei. But the scholars didn't know, so they gave it this name, and everyone was laughing and saying, it's a terrible name, or something's really going to happen. And with the fire, although it happens in the first month, the Tenmei Nengo is dropped, right? And then they come Kansei, and Kansei, nobody could find any fault with it, right? It means something like lenient government, right? So symbolic. And as for the fire of London, because it was 1666, so it's the year of the beast of the apocalypse, and we have the diary of Samuel Pepys, who said everyone's going around saying something terrible is going to happen this year, but they only say that because they're secret papists. And if you're a proper Protestant, you would never think of anything like that, and he scorns the idea. And then, of course, the fire does happen, but it seems people didn't particularly blame the apocalypse in that, but I don't know about English history. Continuing the other thing, I think I would go so far as to say that nobody ever calls Kyoto in the 18th century. Maybe someone will find it. I think it occasionally turns up on colophons, like at the back of a published book, you have to give the address to the publisher, and they quite often do say Kyoto there. But otherwise, I would really bet that nobody ever said Kyoto. They might, every very, very occasionally have written it, but usually they wrote Kyo, and we don't know whether they pronounce that Miyako or Kyo. But the Dutch sometimes refer to the Japanese city of Kyo, which they spell Kwau. So sounds like to them they were hearing people say Kyo. But the normal term for anyone who had any pretensions to writing something grand, not just a shopping list, but ideas about, then it's Keishi, always Keishi, right? Whereas she is master. So the metropolitan master or something like that. The city which inculcates to other cities how they should be. And then I would even go so far, though I'm tempted to say this, as Matthew said, turn off the recording, I think it might have even been Matsuda Sadanobu and the rebuilding after the fire that brings back the name Kyoto. But I'm not sure to say that, but just doing research of things like Kokusho Somokuroku, the word Kyoto doesn't turn up in book titles until the 19th century, but then you start to get them. Almost always Keishi, and Joshua will be telling us about the Miyako nation today. Nobody called it the Kyoto nation today. And then finally, just so that I leave time for talk, you mentioned about art. Well, of course, there was a massive reconstruction project afterwards, which included temple buildings and the very small number of temples that hadn't been destroyed, give out some of their kusama and things to other places. So there's several temples in Kyoto today which proudly say, this came from such a place after the fire. And then the big
figure in Kyoto art world at the time is Maruyama Okyo, who has tremendous production after this time, and probably because of that goes blind a few years later. So Okyo was blind, I think, by 1780. But I don't know there's any art to commemorate the fire. So the kind of fire scrolls, you probably know Dori Müller, for example, who's working on disaster scrolls depicting things like famines, and you get a lot of scrolls of that. But I don't think anyone ever made a scroll of the fire of Kyoto, subject to correction. You do get it when a decade later the Daibutsu, the Miyako Daibutsu, which had survived the fire, is burnt down, and that does leave a visual record, a very famous painting by Nagasawa Rosetsu. But I think this, well, apart from the fact all the artists have fled, nobody commemorates it in visual ways. So it becomes a kind of big silence which you have no means of talking about.
Very big silence.
A few weeks, thank you very much for this very inspiring, informative talk. It was a pleasure to listen to you this time too. A few weeks ago we had a guest from Oriental here, Morita Keiko, who was talking about Kokaku Tenno's role in waka poetry and his role in, I mean, he seems to be a very special tenno, as you mentioned, and his position somehow brought it about that he got interested in also in Foucault idea, the Kokugaku and Foucault ideas, and of course this was just another topic, and he did not mention his waka. Kokaku Tenno's waka, but what I wanted to ask you is about the historical consciousness, the setting, how historical consciousness about this time seems to have changed, and maybe also under the influence of Kokugaku. And this Kokugaku topic is one that connects Kokaku Tenno as somebody from the court, from not only Kokaku Tenno but also his waka friends and all the aristocrats doing waka at the court. This Tosho Kadan, later with the Jige group. So the Kokugaku serves kind of as a membrane to where information about or this ideology of Foucault comes in and contributes to this interest of the Tosho in Jige poetics, where Kokugaku is more proliferating than, of course, in Tosho. So I was just thinking about this back to the roots, this idea of back to the roots. That's not only because of the special position of Kokaku Tenno as somebody who's outside of the real Tenno family. Maybe this is one of the reasons, but also the general setting and the general historical consciousness evolving in the 1770s, 80s, 90s.
Thank you. It's a fantastic question. Again, it's like, it's a huge topic, and somebody can do a PhD on that very thing. There was an interesting exhibition on Kokaku Tenno in the exhibition catalogue, which I have, which has quite a lot of his Shinkan of waka and things. I don't know whether Sadanobu was a reader of Kokugaku. You may know the answer to that. I don't really know. But certainly the word Foucault is on his lips all the time and throughout his diaries. He also copied out the entire tale of Genji, I think, 12 times.
No.
I mean, no, I don't think anyone else ever did that.
He needs to get a lot of nerve.
Well, he was in retirement for a long time, and maybe who knows whether he really did. But he gives the dates actually. He'd only finished for 10 days and he begins again. So I think, but actually quite interesting, he doesn't ever write a treatise on it, right? So I think he's totally obsessed with handing on of the materiality of things. I don't think he's terribly interested in the new kaishaku about anything. In fact, I think he's the one that hates heterodoxy, for example. But he really is concerned that things, so 200 years into the shogunal regime, things are disappearing. And he wants to keep them. So replication, copying, he has all sorts of things copied. Tani Buncho goes around copying all sorts of ancient works of art for him. And one that he's very keen on, there's the Nenju Gyoji Emaki, right? Which probably you know, but there's a Heian period scroll of all the court rituals from the glorious past, which was lost but survived in a copy. And he was very concerned that that copy should be preserved, so he has it recopied. And then he says, well, if we're looking at these old rituals, why don't we revive them? So he revives quite a few. And then looks around in himself and says, we can look at this Nenju Gyoji Emaki and see what the Heian life was really like. So what's somebody in the future going to look at if they want to know what our life was really like? Ukiyo-e. Oh my God, somebody might look at that stuff and think that's what we were like. And he's filled with horror at the idea that somebody would think, and that's what the people do, right? Many people today think, it must have been so great in hair. So someone's a very complex person. I don't think he's an intellectual in the sense that people you study photography work, but he's very, very concerned about the past. And he's very conscious of himself as being 200 years after the Kaikoku, they called it, right at the beginning of the country under Ieyasu. And finally, something I stress in my writing on the subject, is that he came from Shirakawa. Right? Shirakawa was the end of the Heian realm. So he's somebody from the periphery that's brought into man as a center. He's always aware that there's Japanese society has an edge. If you're sitting there in Kyoto, it's great, you're in the center of things, you're going. But he knew the boundary between Heian and the wildest beyond, and he didn't want, he wanted to use them.
Yeah, very interesting. So, during your talk, the sparks were certainly flying, but you weren't incendiary. So that's little fire drinks. Some disparate thought, just some disparate ideas. You mentioned a waka by Munenobu,
Yes.
in which he refers to a bejeweled landscape. Now that's probably a direct quote, direct borrowing from Hojoki. Now the Hojoki is one of the most descriptive records that we have of a decade of natural disasters that plagued Kyoto after 1177. You have the Angen fire of 1177. You have the great tornado of 1180. You've got the movement of the capital to Fukuhara in 1180 as well. And then you have this famine of 1181. So Kyoto just gets clobbered for this decade. And Hojoki is really very descriptive about this. And while it's a literary text, it's also extremely evocative. So, and it's really just a comment. You might want to look at the way that Hojoki figured into the imagination of your fire. But the other thing I want to mention, this isn't a question. It's more of a musing or a reflection. But I think you're right that the idea that Kyoto, fire wasn't really at the edge of the public imagination in Kyoto during Edo. I think you're right about that, especially in compared to how salient of an issue it was in Edo. But that's strange, because Kyoto burnt down a lot. And I think we need to ask why it wasn't part of the discourse on all registers of the discourse. And I don't know the answer to that, but we probably should find out why. Because it burned down just as much as any place else, if not more. I mean, Kyoto's got a history. And let me just tell you from my own experience, and this is again just a comment, I'll be looking through documents for a certain period, and of course I'm looking at Yoshimitsu and his architecture, and there's this and there's that, and this and that. And there'll be a little entry that says 3/4 of the city burned down today. And then Yoshimitsu did this, and I think, what? Why isn't there more? And there are cases like Hojoki, but it's not as eminent. It's not as I don't know. There's something.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the size of the city. Kyoto is, after all, nothing like as big as Edo, and you've got your river there. Maybe just escape was easier. There may have been less of a human toll with the fires. I don't know. They had much bigger avenues than Edo had, so things could be stopped and they served as fire breaks. I don't know, but it's weird. The beneficial aspect of the fires, Harold mentioned the Great Plague and things in Europe. This is why Japan never had any plagues. It wasn't because people washed, it was because fire got rid of all the rats. It didn't matter about the people. Well, this is what people say, I mean, who knows? But, finally, Hojoki, I really looked for people invoking the Hojoki. And I didn't find it. But maybe other people know. And even when the Daibutsu burns down, and you think that people will be talking about the tales of the Heiki and that, I didn't find it. There may be, that there were embedded references that you've alluded to, which I didn't notice. But nobody said, as Kamono Chomi said, nobody said, I'm going to go live in a square hut in the countryside, which is an odd category.
But Yokoshiki that's a Hojoki, it's the bejeweled.
Yeah, thank you for that.
It's also
Sorry? It's more common than that.
It's what, sorry?
It's a Bakura Kotoba. So it's just one of the words you use to describe.
Just by Kyoto.
Okay. It's more general.
You mentioned procurement of wood twice.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Conrad Todman has argued that the fires in 17th century Edo, especially the Meideki fire, was one of the main incentives or reasons that the Bakufu engaged in this sort of new regime of silviculture, protecting certain forests and cultivating, getting really serious about cultivating trees. I was wondering if there's something similar happening here, if this is taken, be it more for regional authorities, or for the Bakufu take this to get more serious about silviculture, or simply, where did they get all the wood for this reconstruction, especially the palace, when the capital area was supposed to be completed long ago?
I don't know the answer. It may be that the problems they had with wood was precisely because, unlike Edo, there weren't these vast stockpiles of wood around the place because they knew there was going to be a fire at some point. So Edo has all these zaimokuya around, often by the river, so that they can be transported easily, but also they won't burn if a fire comes and the wood is lying in the water. But also those references, I didn't give my sources, I didn't have time, but those references to the emperor demanding that he gets the first choice of all the wood comes from the Dutch. And the Dutch, they're misinformed and they don't speak Japanese, but they don't make things up. So they've heard that from somebody. So it must have been what people were saying. The palace was built, and it took, within 8 months, I think the palace was back up again. It's quite quick. And they used things like hand scrolls to try and tell what the original design would have been like. I don't know whether modern-day historians of palace architecture say the palace built at that time, to what extent did they get it right, and to what extent did they misinterpret it. Don't even know. To what extent do we even know what the Heian Palace was like?
There's a lot of new work on that, and they got it really, 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 really wrong.
So the one in Kyoto today is still really, really wrong, is it?
Yep.
Yeah.
This is actually a good segue to my question, which is about the link of these strategies to the mainland and to antiquarianism, which was really not rampant, but was a big issue in China, in Korea, and in Japan in the late 18th century. And one example is, for instance, the discovery of the kinin, the gold seal, in Shikanojima, which was in 1784. And that might also have been just one of the many instances where, which then actually also resulted in what you quoted, Sadanobu's Shuko Jishu, right? Which is also, of course, also based on Chinese precedents and that terminology. So what is, behind that whole idea of recreating the Heian Palace? Might that be linked to some mainland connection?
Again, all I can say is I don't know. I don't know Chinese and I don't know much about Qing history. I don't know what route it would have been. Of course, there's the Qing themselves relaxed the export ban on books to Japan in the 15, 17, whatever it is. So there's a lot more Chinese books are coming in the end of the 18th century than were coming in at the beginning of the 18th century, which is why you get the rise of Nanga and Bunjin and things like that. So perfectly possible that something like that came in along with it. But I haven't seen any references. Also, I would tend to think of Edo antiquarianism really being something more like the 1820s and 30s. Are there?
Matsuda Sadano was kind of
His Shuko Jishu is after he's gone to retirement, isn't he? When
1800.
So he begins
It's
at there.
1800, so
Right.
the project starts much
Right,
earlier.
much earlier. Yeah. Yes. I just have to say I don't know, but it'd be something fascinating. I mean, I thought, in my own mind, I was thinking it's much related to the 200th anniversary of there. They're aware that it's the 200th anniversary and the 150th anniversary of the death of the Ieyasu, which obviously is a bit before what I was talking about. There's such riots in the countryside, the shogun doesn't dare go to Nikko. And they think, oh my God, that's what things have come to. So I think that they really want the 200th anniversary, and then I don't think it's even celebrated when it comes to it. They sort of let it pass this way.
Now, we have a full house, but most of the people were asking questions around the table. So I was wondering whether there are some questions from some of our students, or those who are sitting in the other end, were... Okay.
Were there any actual reforms after the fire? Like, triggered it anything? Did the people just start rebuilding the way they built before? Or did they think, okay, it all went?
Yes.
We should.
I think so. I think that other than the palace, well, there's a few other historicising things were done. But what's the name of the garden where there's a garden that Murasaki Shikubu had supposedly owned, and that was also reconstructed at the time. But on the whole, people just go back to. But they build it in the way that they know how to. After all, they need accommodation fast, and they just build it as they normally do. The Great Fire of the Great Fire of Edo, after which the shogun commanded everyone must have tiled roofs, and every house must have a fireproof kura. I don't think any such legislation was enforced. And Sadanobu himself leaves office very soon afterwards to devote himself to those scholarly pursuits. So I don't think there's a long-term impact.
Okay, so we have reached our designated lunch time, and the program says we have lunch for speakers and discussants, but we still want everyone else to come back after the lunch break at 2:30 in the same room with Anna and Dreva giving the next presentation.
And there might be some spare food, so if you're starving, please come back early or stay on, linger on.